to this video lecture series for ethics. In this video, we're going to continue our discussion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, Book 2. And we should recall last time when we began discussing Book 2, the major points Aristotle was attempting to make. His primary concern in this book, having shown he thinks that, well, to attain our human purpose or function we need virtue, the question is, well, how do we become virtuous? And he outlined these three different possibilities. Perhaps it's by nature, we're just born virtuous. Perhaps it's through teaching, through someone telling us how to act or following a role model. Or perhaps it's by habit. By performing certain sorts of actions, we build habits which build a certain kind of character. And for Aristotle, as we're going to see, all three of these do play some role. We've already seen that nature plays some role. He doesn't think that we're naturally virtuous. He doesn't think we're naturally vicious. But Aristotle does say we naturally have the ability to become either virtuous or vicious. We have the ability to build a good character or a bad one. And that is a sort of ability or capacity that we are born with. So if we're born with this ability or capacity to build a good character or a bad character, an honest character or a dishonest one, a just one or an unjust one, etc., then what determines what sort of character we'll have? Well, and here we get to Aristotle's primary answer. We saw last time that he says the answer is habit. If you want to become an honest person, you need to perform honest actions. If you want to become a generous person, you need to perform generous actions, and etc. And for him, what this shows is that all of our actions, even just on a day-to-day, everyday basis, really do matter in a deep sense. Because every action you take feeds either the good habits that you should be building or the bad habits that you should be avoiding. And the more you build the bad habits, the harder it is ultimately going to be to disabuse yourself of those habits and to build the sort of character and the habits that constitute the proper human function. Okay, so with those points in place, the real question should be at this point, okay, I know that I have to build proper habits, and I know that I have to build proper habits, I have to act well and avoid acting poorly. But there's really one big major question still looming. How do I know what a good action is, and how do I know what a poor action is? How do I know the difference between acting well and acting badly? Now, in the part of Book 2 we're going to cover in this video, Aristotle is going to give us his answer. But it's first important to see that he gives you some general sort of guidance about the limitations we should expect for this answer. So here's what Aristotle says. He says, since the general account lacks precision, the account at the level of particulars is even less precise. For they do not come in under any skill or set of rules. So the first thing he's saying is, look, I'm not going to be able to give you a sort of explicit set of rules that determine in every single imaginable scenario, here's the right way to act and here's the wrong way to act. Right, so take any real difficult moral dilemma, and let's just use the virtue of honesty. So for instance, let's say that you have a family member who is suffering from an illness, who's in the hospital, and they're attempting to recover from this illness, and the doctors give you some information about the severity of their condition. And the doctors also tell you, look, we disclosed this information to you, but we really have a strong inclination that if you go ahead and tell this information to your family member, it might actually harm their ability to recover. Maybe they'll lose hope at this bad news. Maybe they'll lose the will to continue fighting. And all these things might actually make it more difficult for them to recover. So now, in this sort of situation, we have a real conflict. On the one hand, if we think it's wrong to lie or deceive or withhold information from other people that we might think they have a right to, that's specifically about them, you might say, well, this seems dishonest, right? Because if you go to your family member and they say, well, you talk to the doctors, what did they say? To avoid telling them the information would be a direct lie. So on the one hand, to not tell them seems to violate the virtue of honesty. It seems to be dishonest. On the other hand, it's also a virtue to be beneficent. That means to be kind, to look out for the best interests of others, specifically our family members and those who are closest to us. And so we might say, well, if we do tell the truth, then we know that's going to cause them harm, and don't we have a duty to not harm others, especially those we care about the most? And moral life is rife with these sorts of situations. It's rife with situations in which there seems to be a real conflict of different duties. And so one thing we might want from Aristotle or any other moral philosophers, tell me exactly what I ought to do. Give me a list of instructions that I can follow to know exactly what the right thing to do is in this situation. One thing Aristotle wants to say is that, look, I'm not going to be able to do that. I'm really only going to be able to give you general guidelines. And part of the reason for this actually goes back to Book 1. It wasn't a passage we covered at the time, but in one passage in Book 1, Aristotle says we should only expect the amount of precision from a discipline that discipline really supports. So in mathematics, for instance, you can expect complete precision because that's the nature of the discipline. But ethics, he's going to say, is messy, right? There's real conflicts in our lives. There's difficult choices. And you can't always say, here's the exact right thing to do, or we can't know it with the sort of precision we can in mathematics anyway. So the first thing to keep in mind is that when you ask this question, how do I know if I'm acting well or acting poorly? How do I know if I'm building good or bad habits? Aristotle says we have to think more in terms of general guidelines in terms of specific rules. And he gives us a sort of helpful analogy to start thinking about what those guidelines might look like. So he says agents must always look as what is appropriate in each case as it happens, as do doctors and navigators. Right, so let's carry out this analogy of a doctor. Okay, so for instance, let's say that you're a doctor and a patient comes to you, they have some condition, you prescribe some sort of medication. And let's suppose that medication at the current dose is causing certain bad side effects, or on the other hand, maybe it's not being effective. Now, if that's the case, if it's causing certain undesirable side effects that are too severe, you might say, well, something's gone wrong here, right? Maybe the dose of the medication is too high. There's an excess of medication. On the other hand, if the medication is not in a dose that's enough to actually have the desired effect, you might say maybe there's a deficiency of the medication. And it might be sort of a trial and error process to determine what is the exact right dose of medication for this person in this circumstance with this particular illness. So, I think this is what Aristotle has in mind about the moral life as well. The way he's thinking about it is, look, I can't tell you exactly how to act in every situation, but if you act a certain way, you might notice certain general features of that situation that tell you, oh, I acted in an incorrect way in this instance. I need to sort of change the dials or tone it back next time. Right? So he's going to take a sort of approach which is trial and error. We need to test out and see whether we've gone wrong or if we hit the mark, as he likes to put it. And to make this a little more explicit, right? So in the doctor analogy, I use the idea of an excess of medication or a deficiency of medication. We're going to see that Aristotle has the exact same sort of thing in mind for virtue. Because he asks himself the question, how are good states, the states we want, how are they corrupted or ruined? And he says this, first then let us consider this, the fact that states like this are naturally corrupted by deficiency and excess, as we see in the cases of strength and health. So let's start not with a state of virtue, let's start with a physical state, like strength or health. Okay, so if we think about strength, what is the desired state that we want to be in? Strength. And what do we need to become strong? We need exercise. Okay, so you might do the same sort of thing. You might say, okay, I want to become strong. And you might say, at first you're like, okay, I'm going to work out all the time. I'm going to be able to just lift these giant weights. My numbers are going to go way up, right? And so you just work out constantly. But then you find you're just completely fatigued and you become injured. In that case, it's pretty clear that the amount of exercise you were doing was too much. Your body couldn't handle it. On the flip side, you might say, well, I'm just kind of dip my toe in the water. Maybe I'll work out, maybe once every other week. And then you notice that on that regimen, you're not making any sort of strength gains at all. You're still weak. You're maybe slightly stronger than you were before, but not considerably so. In that case, you notice that you've had too little exercise. And the same thing with health, right? So if we think that one thing that contributes to your health is the amount of food you intake, you could be overnourished with too much food, you're not healthy. You could be malnourished with too little food, you're not healthy. So health comes about through the right amount of food. Strength comes about through the right amount of exercise. And the point that Aristotle wants to make here is that he thinks this is a general feature of all states we want. All states that we desire, whether they're physical states or states of the soul like virtue, all of these states are corrupted by excess or deficiency. So, and he says that here, the same goes then for temperance, courage, and the other virtues. Temperance and courage then are ruined by excess and deficiency and preserved by the mean. And this is the terminology he uses. You have an excess, you have too much of something, a deficiency, you have not enough of something, and then you have the mean. That's the middle point between those. It's the right mark that you want to hit to attain the desired state. And so he says we can do this with all the virtues. Take courage, for example. So if you have too much of whatever courage is, you'll be rash, right? You'll be the sort of person who is not facing danger in the right way, but is running toward every danger, even when it's a bad idea, even when it's unnecessary, when it's just simply not needed, when you're putting your life at risk needlessly. If you have too little of whatever constitutes courage, you're a coward, you have cowardice. It's a vice of deficiency, right? So there's dangers that you need to face in your life. There's certain enemies that you need to face to protect others, and you're simply not doing it because you haven't trained yourself to be able to face that danger. So just like strength is corrupted by excess and deficiency, so is courage. Too much, and you're rash. Too little, and you're a coward. Whatever courage is, it's a mean between those extremes, and that is the virtuous state. Same thing with temperance. So, temperance might be a little less familiar, but basically what temperance is a virtue in which you have the right attitude or disposition towards seeking pleasure, right? And so on the one hand, right, so we can think of temperance as a sort of virtue that has to do with foregoing pleasure and seeking it in the right way. So think about an excess of temperance. If you say to yourself, you know what, I'm going to never enjoy any pleasure. I'm never going to undertake any physical enjoyments or any delights. I'm simply going to live a very sort of simple life where I completely ignore pleasure. Now, interestingly enough, Aristotle says that this is a vice. And it's interesting because we don't necessarily always think of it that way, right? So there are, of course, people like monks, for instance, who will live these lives where they really do stave off pleasure. But we don't normally consider that a vice. We might say to ourselves, well, that's not really how I want to live, or seems like an odd or foreign way to live to me, but that's fine. We don't think of it as a vice. But Aristotle does. He says, we have this disposition to forego pleasure, and if you have too much of that, he says you're insensible. You're unable to enjoy the simple pleasures of life. And of course, as we've seen, for Aristotle, pleasure is not the end-all be-all of human life, obviously. However, it is a capacity we have, and so it should be developed properly. And so if you have no ability to enjoy pleasure, you're insensible. But if you're deficient in your ability to forego pleasure, if you can never stop yourself, if you're constantly seeking after every single pleasure, this will obviously bring ruin to your life, and this is also a vice. It's a vice of deficiency, we say, or intemperate. So whatever temperance is, it's a mean between those extremes. It's enjoying pleasures in the right way, in the right amount, at the right time, with the right people, etc., etc. And you'll see Aristotle consistently through Book 2 use that sort of language, right? Courage is facing danger in the right way, with the right people, in the right situations. Same for temperance, same for justice and honesty. Okay, so this is the general picture that we get of virtue. Virtue is this mean between the two extremes. But an interesting question that you should have here, and I've sort of hinted at the answer, but you might wonder, well, what is it that we can have too much or too little of? Right, so something about courage. It would be weird to say, well, if you have too much courage, you're rash, or if you have too little courage, you're a coward. Well, how could you have too much courage? I mean, courage is a virtue. Courage is a good thing. You should want courage to the maximal extent. So it's actually not quite right to say that the rash person has too much courage. It's not quite right to say that the cowardly person has too little courage. Rather, from this passage, we get an idea of what it is we're supposed to be regulating and not having too much or too little of. So Aristotle says, not only are virtues produced and developed from the same origins and by the same means as those from which and by they are corrupted, but the activities that flow from them will consist in the same things. So when we have any state, a physical state or a virtue, the mean point and the excess and the extremes, the excess and deficiency, all deal with the same underlying thing. He says it's all a matter of the same origin, the same underlying source. So think about it this way. The person who's courageous, what have they successfully regulated about themselves? Well, I would say that the person who's courageous has properly dealt with their disposition to face danger. Right? So you can think about it this way. All human beings are born with some ability to face danger. Some people are born with a greater ability to do so. Some people are born with lesser ability to do so. But we all have some ability to face danger. It's a psychological disposition that we all have. And so you can think of courage as just the ability to regulate that disposition properly. If your disposition to face danger is too strong, then it's excessive and you're rash. If your disposition to face danger is too weak, that's a deficiency and you're a coward. If you have regulated your disposition to face danger in just the right way, that's the mean and you're courageous. Same thing with temperance. We all have a disposition to forego pleasure. Some people can much more easily forego pleasure. Some people have a much more difficult time foregoing pleasure. But we all have the ability, we have this disposition to forego it. It's possible for us. And so if you have an excess of foregoing pleasure, if you can never enjoy pleasure, if that psychological disposition is too strong, then you're insensible. If it's too weak, you're deficient and you're intemperate. If you control your disposition to forego pleasure in just the right way, with just the right people, in just the right circumstance, then you've hit the mean and you have the virtue of temperance. Now, I want to make the point that given this, we can see how this is related to Aristotle's view that virtue arises from habit. Because we all inherit from nature these basic psychological dispositions of human beings: to face danger, to forego pleasure, to tell the truth. Right? We all inherit these basic psychological abilities, but what determines whether they're too strong or too weak, whether they're excessive or deficient? Again, it's the habits we form. By forming good habits, we will hit the mean. But if we form excessive or deficient habits, then that will lead us into vice. So we can see how Aristotle's doctrine of the mean is closely related to his claim that in fact virtue is a kind of arises from habit. So we can sort of fill out in a little more detailed sense the picture of how Aristotle thinks it is that we should act and the questions we should ask ourselves every day as we go about our lives. So for instance, let's just say we're talking about courage. So the question you ask yourself is, how should I regulate my disposition to face danger? And you have two choices. You can act well or act poorly. If you act well, then you're hitting the mean. You're not deficient in regulating this disposition, nor are you excessive. And if you act well, then that builds the habit of regulating that disposition properly. And if you form that habit and you strengthen it enough, then it will finally become an ability. Right? So acting well leads to habit. Habit leads to an ability, a fundamental part of your character. Where just like last time I explained that for the expert in basketball or the expert piano player, doing the right actions and the skills inherent to their task are so ingrained in their bodies, they hardly have to think about it. And we would say not only do they have the abilities of playing the piano or shooting a basketball, they excel in those abilities and they hardly have to think about it. But of course, imagine that you act poorly and you build bad habits. Then you're also going to form an inability. If you act poorly consistently and you feed your habit of, let's say, cowardice, so you make your disposition to face danger weaker and weaker and weaker, eventually you're going to have an inability to face danger in the right way at all. And so we can see how, again, what it means for him to act well or act poorly is to hit the mean. And while he can't tell you exactly what that looks like in every circumstance, it does give you a way to move forward, because you might think on the last time, like, well, the last time I faced danger, maybe that was an unnecessary danger. Maybe I should dial it back next time. Or you might say, we've all had this experience where there was a situation you could have stood up for yourself, a situation you could have stood up for another person and you didn't. You remained silent. You didn't say something when you felt on reflection that you should have. And you think back and you say, wow, I'm ashamed of what I did. I don't feel I act in the right way. I felt I fed a bad habit of not facing danger or opposition. And next time I'm going to try to improve that by seeking to face danger in those situations. So we don't get exact guidelines, but I think we can let our emotions and our feelings and the consequences of our actions to some extent guide us. If you're doing things that have good consequences, if you're doing things that produce pride in you, then that probably is a good sign you're close to hitting the mean. If you're doing things that make you feel ashamed, embarrassed, if the consequences are disastrous for you and others, probably a good sign you're not hitting the mean. Okay, now, we've only talked about two virtues, courage and temperance, but so for Aristotle, these are not the only virtues. There are many virtues he discusses throughout the Nicomachean Ethics, and in this table I just have a few of them to sort of talk through. Because if you think about it, there are many human dispositions we have, and if that's true, then any of those dispositions, there's going to be a virtue, there's a way to use it properly, and there'll be vices, ways to use it improperly. So he says we all have a disposition to give money. If you do it properly, that's generosity. If you're giving out too much money, you're being wasteful. And if you're not giving money enough, you're stingy. Here's a great one, the disposition to express anger. We've all felt the situation. It's a great shame-inducing scenario, I guess, that you can put yourself in. We've all been in a situation where we expressed anger, where on reflection we said, well, that really wasn't fair of me, that wasn't right. I really wish I wouldn't have become so quick to be angry in that situation. So if you feed your disposition to be angry too much, you'll be quick-tempered. That's an excess, that's a vice. But likewise, we can all think of situations where we were slow-tempered. You say, I should have shown some anger in that situation. I should have stood up for myself. Maybe I was too slow-tempered. That's also a vice. If you're even-tempered, that's the mean. That is a virtue. And another disposition we all have is a disposition to represent ourselves favorably. So that just means to say things about ourselves that make us look good in the eyes of others. And if you do this in the right way, you're being truthful. But if you have an excess of this, if you're constantly consumed with how other people are viewing you and your reputation of looking good in front of others, then that's boasting, and that's a vice. At the same time, if you have too little of this, if you have and this is actually something we'll be talking about next week, specifically with Aristotle, but if you've accomplished something great and you refuse to acknowledge it and you constantly downplay your accomplishments, you're self-deprecating. When you do something good, you should own up to it. You should say yes, and you should be honest and truthful about it and not exaggerate. But you should say, yes, I did accomplish this and something I feel pride about. So the main point here is that for Aristotle, virtue is a sort of mean between the extremes. And one question I want to just throw out there, and I would be interested to hear what you have to think about this, is, do I think this is right? Is it the case that virtue is always a sort of midpoint between two excesses? Or are there some virtues that we say that in of themselves are extreme? Are there some virtues, are there some situations that demand extreme behavior of us? And if that's true, is that a problem for Aristotle's account? So again, I'll be interested to see what you have to say about that. Okay, so another important point he makes in Book 2 is that given this, he gives us a little further indication of how it is that we can become virtuous. And so he makes an interesting claim. He says, virtue and vice are intimately related to pleasure and pain. And this might seem like a strange claim to make at first, because he's already told us, he's already shown us how pleasure, for instance, is not our highest good. It is not the ultimate good of a human life. So what does he mean when he say virtue and vice are very closely connected to pleasure and pain? So I would submit that there's two things he means by this. The first thing he means is that the virtuous person, to be a truly virtuous person, have a virtuous character, you have to find pleasure in virtue and take pain in the extremes of vice. That is, the truly virtuous person is someone who doesn't just do the right thing, but they actually enjoy doing the right thing. And if they do the wrong thing, it's actually painful to them. So Aristotle puts it this way: we must take as an indication of a person's states the pleasure or pain consequent on what he does. Right, so if you want to know if someone's truly virtuous, take note of, after they do an action, if they act well, are they happy about it? Did they enjoy themselves? Did they feel pleasure? If they acted poorly, did they feel pain? Because a truly virtuous person would feel like that. They would be so committed to virtue that it would be an enjoyable thing to them. And they would be so averse to vice that if they did succumb to a moment of weakness and acted in a vicious way, it wouldn't be enjoyable. Even if it may be slightly in the moment, certainly not upon reflection. And so we might want, this is an important claim, and in fact it's one that he had earlier made in Book 1, Chapter 8. And there he says, "For no one would call a person just if he did not enjoy acting justly, or generous if he did not enjoy generous actions, and the same goes for the other virtues." And we might wonder why this is the case. Like, why isn't it enough that I just act honestly and justly and generously and kindly and courageously? Why do I have to enjoy them as well? I mean, if I perform an honest action or a just action, and the good that I do from those actions is produced in the world, people benefit or they're not harmed, then what difference does it make whether I feel good about doing it or not, or enjoy it? Why can't I just follow the rules? Why do I have to be excited about following the rules? Well, I think one example that can help us understand this point comes from a philosopher named Michael Stalker, and he uses this example, which I'll call the dutiful hospital visitor. Okay, so what is the example? He says, suppose you're in a hospital, recovering from a long illness. You're very bored and restless and at loose ends when Smith comes in once again. You are now convinced more than ever that he is a fine fellow and a real friend, taking so much time to cheer you up, traveling all the way across town, and so on. You are so effusive with your praise and thanks that he protests that he always tries to do what he thinks is his duty, what he thinks will be best. So you're in the hospital, and, this guy Smith comes to visit you, and you praise him and say, thanks, this is really, you're being a great friend. He says, no, don't worry about it. I'm just doing my duty. Now, at first, you sort of think, as he says here, that Smith is engaging in a polite form of self-deprecation, relieving the moral burden. You just think he's being, humble. He doesn't want to brag, right? But then you two speak more. And the more you speak, the more clear it becomes that he was telling the literal truth. That it is not essentially because of you that he came to see you, not because you are friends, but because he thought it was his duty. Perhaps as a fellow Christian or a communist or whatever, or this is my favorite part, or simply because he knows of no one more in need of cheering up and no one easier to cheer up. So imagine that you really found out that he says, look, the only reason I'm here to see you, I'm not doing this for your own sake. I just understand it's my duty. I know I have a moral obligation to visit people in the hospital. And look, I have a moral obligation to cheer people up. And I knew you were really down on your luck. So I figured the best way I can meet this duty was simply to come see you in the hospital. Now, let's say, well, okay, it's good that you're doing what you think is morally right, but is the way you've acted, has it really inculcated a true human connection? One way to think about this is, how would you think about Smith as your friend after this? Right, you might say, well, after you find this out, you wouldn't say, well, Smith is a great friend of mine. You would say, Smith doesn't truly understand the nature of friendship. He doesn't understand the virtue of generosity. It's not just about following the rules and doing something because you think it's your duty, because you think morality forces you to. It's doing something because you care about the other person, because you enjoy doing what is right, because of the pleasure that you both get from your presence there at the hospital. And so I think Aristotle is getting at something like this. We can't say that someone is truly committed to virtue if they don't take pleasure in doing what's right. And this also brings us to the second way in which virtue is related to pleasure and pain. So because we've already said that the virtuous person enjoys virtue and the virtuous person doesn't enjoy vice. What this means is to become a virtuous person, you really have to think about your own relationship to pleasure and pain. You need to understand how to regulate pleasure and pain correctly. So here's what Aristotle says: for the virtue of character is concerned with pleasure and pains. It is because of pleasure that we do bad actions, and pain that we abstain from noble ones. And I think this is such an important statement and one we can all immediately resonate with. Think of those times in your life when you've done things you know are morally wrong. When you know that you've done something dishonest or unjust or you've been unkind. What was it that caused you to do those bad actions? Very likely it was some sort of immediate pleasure seeking. Right, so even if it's, sort of a vindictive pleasure, like let's say you're unkind to someone because you're holding a grudge against them, it just gives you pleasure to see them, suffering or in pain or have something bad to them happen to a certain extent. That's a certain sort of pleasure that you're giving into, and it's a sort of pleasure in a bad action you're performing. Or, a classic example I've used a lot, if you know you can get away with a lie in a job interview, presumably the reason you did that bad action is because of the pleasure that you think you would gain from getting the job. And then why is it that we sometimes can't perform noble, good actions? Well, I think courage is a great example here. What is it that can cause us to become cowards? It's because of the pain we perceive that would follow from having to face danger, having to face opposition. So for Aristotle to become a good person, you need to think really carefully about your relationship to pleasure and pain and what you're taking pleasure in and what pains you. And in fact, so what we see from Aristotle is that in order to act correctly, we want to make sure pleasure lines up with virtue in the right way. So to be a virtuous person, when you perform the correct action or feel the right emotion, you should feel pleasure, and then you're a virtuous person. If you perform an incorrect action or emotion, or feel an incorrect emotion, that should be painful, and that's also what the virtuous person does. But what the vicious person does is that these are reversed. When they perform the correct action or emotion, they feel pain. It's like a burden to them to tell the truth, a burden to them to be just. Instead of focusing on the fact that they've done the right thing, they focus on what they gave up. They focus on the job they could have got by lying or the money they could have got by stealing, instead of taking pleasure in doing what's right. And when they do what's incorrect, they feel pleasure. And that's precisely what leads to vice. So for Aristotle, virtue is a mean, and it's a mean that the virtuous person takes pleasure in and literally will feel pain when they do something that is either excessive or deficient. Okay, so I will cut this video there. I hope that this video was useful, and I will see you next time.